Hello and welcome to Meet the Author. I'm your host, Ken Marks. Meet the Author is brought to you by the Institute for Global Transformation. We're a nonprofit, all-volunteer organization devoted to transforming the world, both individually and collectively. We invite you to visit us on our website at ifgt.net. And if you'd like to join our community of change makers, there is a join button on the top menu, and that will take you to our various membership options. And if you'd like to support our work, including programs like this one, there's a donate button also on our top menu bar, and that will take you right to PayPal. This program is being recorded and will be published on IFGT's YouTube channel. And so we invite you to look us up on YouTube, and there's the ubiquitous subscribe button that hopefully you're familiar with, and we invite you to please subscribe. And then right next to that, there's a little bell icon. And if you'll click on that, that will set up notifications so you know when we post new content on our channel. We call this program Meet the Author because we give those attending this recording live to interact directly with our guests. And so we invite our live audience to submit questions in the chat. And if you would like to communicate with our guests directly, please just type the letter Q, and that'll be our signal that you'd like to come on camera and ask your question directly. Otherwise, if you'd prefer, you can just type your questions in the chat, and then we'll read them as they come up and when we have a break in the conversation. So with that, our guest tonight, delighted to talk to. It's been a very interesting month reading, getting prepared for this. He's got a podcast I'll talk about in a moment. I watched at least one episode of that. This is John Tsilimparis, and his professional credentials are MFT, which I believe stands for Marriage and Family Therapist.
Correct.
And we will be covering a number of things, but anchoring the conversation in around one of his books, which is titled Retrain Your Anxious Brain, Practical and Effective Tools to Conquer Anxiety. And you're seeing a picture of the book cover now. So I'll read a brief bio for John, and then we'll get our conversation started. So John Tsilimparis, MFT, has worked as a psychotherapist for almost 30 years. He is a former staff therapist in the Department of Psychiatry at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and in the Department of Addiction Medicine at Kaiser Permanente in Los Angeles, California. John is very well connected with many of the best mental health treatment facilities, recovery programs, psychiatrists, and other specialists around the country. In his career, he has appeared in the media as a go-to expert on many mental health issues. He appeared on KCBS TV, KABC TV, KCAL TV, KCAL, and KTLA TV, and other news programs to comment on subjects such as depression, suicide, anxiety, celebrity addictions, marriage and divorce, holiday stress, empty nest syndrome, seasonal affective disorder, and then what I'm reading says, et cetera, but I think that is every known problem known to man. So you covered it all, John. That's really kind of you and very helpful. John was also featured as a regular on the TV documentary series Obsessed on the A&E television network. He's also appeared on Larry King Live, Collection Intervention, and The View. And as I mentioned earlier, he hosts a podcast, which is titled Mindfulness for the Soul. John is also proudly serving as co-producer at a show called This Is My Brave. This is a show that maybe we'll just ask John to talk about briefly. This one is the one that will be performed live in Los Angeles. And it is this year, 2022 is that show. So with that, I'll invite John to come on camera, and we'll go ahead and say hello. Welcome. Thank you so much again for doing this. And
thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. I just wanted to say up front that I really I'd like to say I enjoyed reading your book, but I read these books to prepare for these conversations. This one, I put at least as much energy into reading it for what I was getting out of it personally as much as preparing for this conversation. It is incredibly well written for a book on such a difficult topic and something so serious. But it reads easily. It's just full of these very practical tools that are easy to use, but obvious to me. I made files on my computer for all of them, so I can have them with me and use them. They're really, it's just so well done. And one of the things also about it that is so compelling is, in kind of the same spirit as This Is My Brave, you are so open and courageous, sharing your own history with anxiety. And so for me, at least, that just lent so much more credibility. It's not simply the professional training and experience, but anxiety is something that you've lived with and wrestled with, and I believe found some peace with as a human, as a person. And so it really is refreshing to have that kind of honesty and courage and transparency. And so I want to say that up front, because it really was very, very compelling. Some of the things in this book kind of overlap and correspond and support what was talked about in our Meet the Author last month with our guest, Rich Spitzer, who is in our audience tonight. The idea of how we can change our thought process and patterns to be more positive, and have a little bit, well, not a little bit, a lot better control of how we're thinking and how that affects our lives and how we go forward. And so I thought maybe we'll start out just to kind of clarify, John, what is, if we could just make sure that when you're talking about anxiety, because that's the basis of the mental health concern in the book, how is that different than someone just saying that, oh, I just worry?
So everybody worries, and everybody even has a little bit of anxiety. But when you're suffering from anxiety, you have what you would call impairments. You're having trouble going to work or getting work done. You're having trouble taking care of your kids. You're having trouble doing basic things. And sometimes you have a lot of disruption because of that. You can't sleep well. You're eating too much, eating too little. Sometimes it's comorbid with depression. They go together. So again, excessive worries is one thing, but excessive anxiety is when you have impairments and you're not able to function in life.
Okay, so I hope that's clear to me, and I hope everybody is clear with that. It's this is not just your garden variety worry. This is something, and part of what John, again, very kind of, I think, bravely discloses in the book is how really incapacitating his own experience with anxiety was, starting at a very young age, 8 or 9, which was kind of breaking to read.
Another key factor is that when we worry a lot about things, usually when the stressor that we're worried that caused the worry goes away, or maybe just time passes, the excessive worry and or anxiety goes away. But when you have an anxiety disorder, hence anxiety, it doesn't go away that quickly. It lingers, and you start to worry about other things. So your whole day is, jumping from one contingency to another because you're constantly worrying, and it doesn't burn off. Your body stays in what's called threat response.
Yeah. So, and that's a nice point too, that this is something that involves the mind, the emotions, and the body. It has very real physical implications. But let's talk a little bit about, I have had this experience personally, and I've heard many people now interviewed or read others who are considered kind of experts in the field of consciousness and spirituality. And they say the number one question that people ask when they kind of begin an awakening or start on their spiritual path is, what the heck's going on? Am I going crazy? And so how can you help us kind of differentiate when someone may have had a spiritual experience, let's say, if we can use
Mhm.
that label, um, versus something that would be recognized as a real mental health concern?
So it's always good to make a distinction between, being in touch with reality and not being in touch with reality. And that's really the difference. So if you are going crazy and or you have psychosis, let's say, which is really how we classify being crazy, is you have delusions. You think you're, Jesus Christ, or you think you're Elvis. You think you're someone else and you're not really you, and you're not in touch with reality, meaning you can't function in society. Um, you're just living in a different type of world that that doesn't enable you to be again functional. So you could also have hallucinations. You could also be seeing things that aren't there. You could also be hearing voices that are telling you to do bad things. That's typically what psychosis is and what going crazy is. But usually, and I've heard this for the last 28 years, when people have spiritual awakenings, it's a little bit different. But it is scary, I understand, because we don't know what it is in that moment. Is it my intuition guiding me? Is it nurturing me? Is it scaring me because it's something new? Or is it some past fears that I have that are misleading me? And so part of this work is being able to differentiate between the two very sort of non-judgmentally and very calmly, either with friends or family or with a therapist or with a guide or with groups of people, to be able to talk about that and talk about that openly. So again, there's a big difference between being out of touch with reality and having these hallucinations or delusions, and then also just having a spiritual awakening, which is something inside me is opening up. I'm able to separate, my thoughts from my awareness and my feelings and all that stuff. And so I try to nurture that in everybody as well too.
And as we had talked earlier, I think there are also some fairly objective metrics that are used because in the DSM that used for the actual diagnosis of mental health, in that there are codes that identify a spiritual experience or awakening as distinct from some type of psychotic event, let's say. And so there were, I believe, like one of the objective measures you had talked about were temporal differences in like how long these things last, or how, or the recall that people have of these things.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of spiritual awakening as being a lot more open to what lies beyond in your thinking state, everyone's very stuck in their thinking state. When you're able to separate that and be more aware and being more of your feeling state, it scares people a little bit. So, um, if again, I like to look at my notes because I want to make sure that my quotes are good. So again, if I isolate the state of being human from my thinking, then I become less my thoughts and I become more consciousness. And I think for somebody that's been very stuck in their thinking, very stuck in their goals and their particular direction in life, or maybe have gone through trauma and have suffered a lot, it's quite a break. And I mean that in a good way, not a psychotic break, but it's quite a break into a different way of waking up in the morning and relating to the world.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so one of the things that I think we need to be conscious about in preparing and creating a program like this on this topic is to be very clear that we are beings that have all these components, our thoughts, our emotions, our physical bodies, and some aspect of a different self. And you can label that spirit or soul or higher self or consciousness, whatever you want to call it. And there's every possibility on that spectrum of awakening and delusion, let's say, that's possible. And it is possible that one could be experiencing both at the same time. And so
Yes.
I want to make sure that we encourage people to get any help, or if they are concerned and they're worried, to not be terribly concerned. And we may get into talking about some of the taboos and stigma in a moment, but want to make sure that people, if they have any concerns, they get help. And it is not uncommon that when you are going through some type of awakening, that things get stirred up, and there may be things that you do need some counseling help with to process through. And that's part of your journey on the path. And so they can be related. And on another hand, not the other hand, when you are experiencing a spiritual awakening and you're pretty comfortable that, no, I know I'm not going crazy, but I don't know what's going on. That's where communities like IFGT can be there for you, to come in and have a network of people that you can talk to and share your experience and ask the questions and find out that, yeah, these are recognized experiences, and you found a home that you can ask questions of other people, get some help. So just want to
Yeah, and most of the time when I've
bit.
seen that, it's not been, and I know you're not saying this, but it wasn't something that happened overnight.
Mhm.
It didn't happen in an hour. This has been going on for quite some time, and it's usually through the process of therapy. Sometimes for people, it's getting sober. Sometimes for people, it's after a trauma or after a death. So usually there's been some kind of shift and movement in their lives, and so they've had to rethink things. Remember, in the old days, well, one of the most popular ways to perform therapy is through cognitive behavioral therapy, which is still great, but it's only one form, and it's one of many. And the goal of that is to restructure your thinking, to unearth things or styles of thinking habits that cause you more distress. But that's a little bit different than mindfulness and meditation or having a spiritual connection. In other words, the spiritual connection is being much more aware that I'm just having thoughts about a particular situation. In other words, awareness, which is the number one pillar, and I'll talk about the 4 pillars of spirituality with psychotherapy. Awareness is, oh yeah, I'm starting to get into the habit of being able to say, those are just thoughts that I'm having. I just noticed that John had thoughts that are worrisome thoughts about the pandemic. If I don't start labeling them as thoughts and heightening my awareness to them, every thought that I have, I start to believe. And so that causes me a lot of distress. So on the smallest level, on the smallest scale, that's the beginning of spirituality, which is being much more aware of your being beyond your thinking state.
Right. And that may provide a nice lead into another topic that I wanted to discuss a bit. And you use this term in your book, the observer. And so that when I first heard it, that was very much a spiritual kind of word of getting in touch with that observer. But it's very much also part of the tools and the therapy, if you will, if I'm allowed to refer to what you put in your book as therapy, the therapy of dealing with something like anxiety, of just becoming more aware. And so again, we're not compartmentalized and you're a being in one moment where you have a mental health issue and that's it, and you're just dealing with the personality, and then somewhere else you're a spiritual being and you have that box that you function in. It's all one thing, and it's neat to me, I guess, to see some of the language also coming together. And so recognizing the observer as an example is one of those similarities,
Right.
and you will be addressing perhaps your needs to manage anxiety as well as furthering your path.
That's
journey.
right. The whole process is I become less a victim of my thoughts and more an observer of my thoughts. And I do that by slowly being aware of what my inner dialogue is, which for somebody that maybe hasn't had a spiritual awakening or has never even had therapy is very victimized by their thoughts, and they believe every thought that they have. Sometimes medication helps to reduce those symptoms too. So it's whatever it takes to pull back, take 5, and have much more awareness. Awareness is the number one pillar. I'll talk about the other pillars later, but without the awareness, and most people are able to do that because they are pretty much insight oriented, but I have had experiences where it's very hard to unfuse to break people up from their thoughts. They're very fused with them, and they don't want to let them go, and they almost become helpless. And those people need more of a spiritual awakening than anybody else. But sometimes they're hard to get to, and sometimes I don't succeed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't want to miss the chance to maybe talk about the other pillars, and I don't know if you can put that in the context maybe of how those pillars might relate both to therapeutic endeavors as well as what someone might turn to or experience as an awakening process.
Yeah, I mean, so in the therapeutic process, and the book is similar, you've got your clinical work, the CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy, and there even is a little bit of mindfulness in there, but it's really to help you reduce your symptoms of anxiety, to restructure your thinking process, and basically to give you better skills on how to manage your day and to regulate your affect a little bit better. But as the book describes, besides the awareness, again, which I already talked about, there's gratitude, and there's connection, and then there's purpose. And each pillar is written in the book. And so gratitude is really important. And what could be more of an awareness practice than to wake up every morning and be dedicated to trying to cultivate gratitude? So in the Dalai Lama book, and I'm not a huge Dalai Lama fan, but I have read a couple of his books. He talks about it's called The Art of Happiness, but the chapter is on gratitude. And what he says is that what we all do, especially in the Western world, is we wake up every morning and we compare ourselves to the more fortunate people that have more money, a bigger house, a better this, a better that. What we don't do is we don't wake up and appreciate what we have, or not compare ourselves to others, but just be grateful for what we have. And maybe even sometimes compare ourselves to the less fortunate, although I don't ever want to say that because that always sounds bad, but we don't do that. So he's saying, what if you every morning thought of 3 things? It could be as basic as, I'm glad I live in a free country, or I'm glad I can see the sun every day, or I'm glad that I have all of my 4 limbs. If you pick 3 things that you name every morning, and your day starts out that way, as opposed to starting out in deficit, that creates awareness, that creates abundance, because you're focusing on what you have, not what you want or what you don't have or what you really, really need. Then the third one, and again, I could elaborate more on that, but I know we're short on time. Then the third one is, as mentioned, it's connection. How am I connecting to people? How am I talking to people? Am I doing things with people? Am I judging people? Am I comparing myself to people? Am I doing activities that involve people? Again, it's good to do activities, and it's great to be in nature. And nature is a big part of it too, but it's really about connection. We didn't grow up in a vacuum. We didn't evolve in a vacuum. We are very interdependent with each other. So how I'm connecting with people is important. And then there's purpose. And I talk about purpose in the book too, which doesn't have to be something extremely lofty. A purpose can be, you know what, I need to provide every day for my kids. You know, some people live paycheck to paycheck and they have the luxury of purpose, but some people don't. And when they don't, you kind of get lost in what you think you should be doing or what you think you can or can't do. When you have necessity, it gives you immediate purpose, but purpose in life is really important. And again, it can be as something simple as, you know, I want to make sure that I have 2 to 3 hours of nature every day, or 1 hour of nature. I want to make sure that I get exercise. I want to make sure that I go to my place of worship today. So it has to be purpose every single day. Idle days are very dangerous for people that suffer from anxiety and depression. And we want to try to keep people structured as much as possible. So if you put those 4 things together and you practice those every single day, you are creating a spiritual awareness.
Yeah. Creating a spiritual awareness. And as you're talking, keep getting insights that, you know, this is also it's the mental, emotional, or psychological equivalent of what a lot of people, I believe, might experience in their awakening, if you will, of realizing they need to change their diet, that, you know, they need to have a healthier body. And we also need to have a healthy mind and a healthy emotional body to go forward and grow as a person spiritually. And so
That's right. Without that awareness, I always say to people, and they always laugh at me about this sort of slogan, but I think that it's true. Without the awareness, you literally become a human doing instead of a human being.
yeah.
It's very hard for people who are very busy in life and who are stressed out to separate that. So if you're a human being, you are much more aware of the things that you need to be aware of. If you're just a human doing, then my God, it's all about comparison. It's all about success. It's all about, making the grade and impressing people and not wanting to disappoint people. It's very stressful. And those are the types of people that I get.
Yeah, and we may I'll try to make sure we get to your afterword in the book, because I failed to mention that the book was recently re-released. Was it here last year?
No, it's going to be that cover that you showed is the new cover, and it's going to be released on March 1st of this year, in 2 weeks or 1 week.
And was that a 10-year anniversary, or what was
No, they just released it because of the pandemic. So no, it came out in 2014.
Yeah. Okay. Right. But because of the pandemic, you wrote an afterword, and we'll touch on that in a couple of minutes. But it's critical, because I think what you were just talking about with human doings, we spent a lot of decades having a lot of cultural conditioning and programming to do just that. And so I think we're seeing some of the culmination of all that time kind of building up. And I think part of what we may be working our way towards is a more collective understanding that we need to rebalance into becoming human beings more collectively and less human doings.
We do. And I always say too that, remember, it's much easier to prevent a mental health crisis. One way is by, again, having balance in your life, maybe paying attention to some of these pillars of spirituality, which are needed for your life, not just the therapy. So it's much easier to prevent a mental health crisis than it is to repair it. Most people come to therapy when they are in a crisis. So I'm not saying everybody needs to come to therapy before a crisis, but if you create this balance in your life and you have some spirituality and you're a much aware person and you are much more of a human being than a human doing, you have a very good chance of averting a mental health crisis.
There were a couple other things that came to me that I thought might be worth sharing, and then see if you have anything to add. But
sure.
One is that even today, even with as much advance as we've had socially, there are still taboos and stigmas about both of these aspects. There are still places, and you talked about in the episode of your podcast I saw with is it the director for This Is My Brave that you were interviewing?
Just the co-producer of the show with me, Karen Pickett. Yeah.
You talked about the fact that still today there are stigmas. I think you recorded that in January, and yet there's also taboos, and we've talked about this within IFGT a fair bit. How you go about telling people and who you tell that you've had a spiritual awakening, and so there are some parallels there, and we, I think, need some cultural shift around that as well, so that it becomes less of the woo-woo and more of just, well, actually, if you stop and think about it. And this kind of conversation, I hope, is helpful toward bringing some of these things into a more compassionate light in both regards.
We get that's too woo-woo, or it's too new agey, or you're kind of really out there and you're not in reality pretty much, or you're religious. They try to make that sort of connection. And as we know, that's not the case. See, to me, it's standard practice. It's standard therapeutic practice to address these issues. I don't even use the word spirituality when I talk about this stuff with them. I just talk about awareness. And if they bring up spirituality, or if it slips in there, that's okay too. But if you look up the word spirituality, the root of it is spiritus, which means to breathe easier. If you look up the word religion, it comes from religio, which is to tie and bind. It's man, God, and community. And that's a whole different thing. So I try to make that distinction for them, especially when I used to work in addiction, because, 12-step is a big part of addiction treatment. And the higher power conversation is huge in 12-step. And it's great. I actually love it. But for some people, they get caught up with that higher power thing is having religion. And it's so not that thing. Higher power is whatever you make it out to be. And it's God or the creator or the universe or the whatever aligns the planets, whatever that is for you. Maybe it's even the sun, that you are a part of that and you are a reflection of that. And it's bigger than you. So that seems to help the field of addiction really, really well. And so to me, it doesn't have to be exclusive to that. To me, it's a design for living. Everybody can benefit from that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one other thing I just wanted to point out in this regard, one spiritual experience, if you will, to use that word, can be intertwined with mental health concerns, is in both contexts, you can have thoughts and beliefs that we then misinterpret. And then suddenly we think we have the truth in all capitals. And,
Right.
and that I think we see in both contexts. Is there, and I'm guessing you've seen this in your practice and see it in both contexts of someone that says, hey, I'm awakened. I now know God spoke to me and I have the truth. And I have the only way of seeing and knowing any of these things.
Yeah. And again, getting back to the Dalai Lama, I said a minute ago that I wasn't a huge fan, but maybe I am. When they asked him what his definition of religion was, he said it was tolerance, compassion, and inquiry, to always stay in the inquiry. So he's not saying, don't walk around feeling like you've got it all figured out, because I don't even know what that means exactly. For everyone, that would be different. But staying in the inquiry, meaning I'm always learning, I'm always evolving. I may not have all of the answers, but to me, spirituality and having some groundedness in the spirituality is like, it's like finding one haystack as opposed to a needle in a haystack. It's one haystack amidst many other haystacks. So I agree with you. I don't think it's about finding one answer and one sort of definition to everything and one belief about everything. I think you're better off being a purist than being a plurist than being a purist. If you're a plurist, you're accepting all kinds of ways of thinking and you stay much more open and there's much more abundance that way.
This is from Christy, and her question is Viktor Frankl's concept of meaning the same as having a purpose?
That's a great question. Well, we should probably define Viktor Frankl's meaning. I mean, this is somebody that went through a great deal of suffering and for many, many years. And within that suffering and within that will that he had to find to live, he had to give himself purpose to actually keep moving forward. So that comes from a very, very difficult place of suffering, which not everybody experiences, although everybody experiences their own suffering in their own context. So yes, I think they could be the same. I think that human living is suffering in many ways too. Nobody is spared from suffering. So I would have to say that there's a lot of similarities there. But again, his book comes from such a specific experience that sometimes for some people, I could see how it would be hard to put the two together, but I see it as very similar.
And I'm just going to hazard a comment as well here. And for anyone that is either in our audience or watches this later that is not familiar with the name Viktor Frankl, please look him up. He's written one of the most influential books in the last century, Man's Search for Meaning, and his story, the suffering that John was referring to, is his personal history as a person in one of the Nazi concentration camps. And so
that's right. Also, excuse me, one of his points was, being born is not purpose enough. It's not meaning enough. You have to create it. Happiness doesn't knock on your door. You have to create it. And suffering isn't necessarily a punishment, but it's more maybe a consequence of, our lives and the choices that we've made and all that stuff, which we can still learn from and grow from. So it's important to remember that being alive is not meaning enough. We have to create it for ourselves. And he had to under the most dire conditions.
So, and I see the two related also, but my sense is that meaning is a bit less tangible, perhaps, and it incorporates purpose, but purpose may not always tie to meaning. So you may find purpose to get out of bed because you've got kids or pets to take care of, but that may not provide a lot of meaning in your life. That may
True.
just be getting you through the day.
That's right. It's true. I'm sort of playing with both words together. Not everybody needs to have lofty meanings to get through the day, but in this sense, the purpose, and I work with people sometimes through the minutia of every single hour. And if you have purpose for 1 hour, then you're good for that hour. And the next hour, you have to find other purpose, even if it's taking a nap. So
Right.
yes, we can make a distinction between the two.
Yeah, and I get the sense that when one continues to grow in their consciousness or spiritually, meaning tends to be a part of that experience. And so even when you don't have an immediate purpose, perhaps you still have that sense of it's worth going on. There's meaning to it. And you address that in the book as well, that you talk about that one of the ways of gaining some peace from anxiety is to recognize our mortality and to derive the meaning of getting as much out of life while we have it as possible. And that is
That's right.
To kind of break out of those very toxic cycles.
If meaning means being a good person so that I can go to heaven, that's fine too. If meaning is I want to buy my first house, that's meaning too. It doesn't have to be. I don't have high expectations for people to create meaning in terms of the quality of the meaning. I want them to create meaning, but the quality of it is up to them, unless it's something horrible and nefarious, then it's something different. But meaning is very important to be able to get out of bed. People don't just get out of bed for the coffee and the eggs. There's got to be something more there.
There's one difference that I kind of see, and wanted to get your thoughts about this, is part of the therapy for improving one's health, especially with regard to anxiety that you talk about, is really getting more in touch with, if you will, who you are as an individual, as example of doing exercises. So you really clarify what your values are, and not the things that people have told you you're good at necessarily, but to really be with that for a while and practice for a month to write down every day kind of what is it about you that you like and what are the things that you value. But that has a very individual getting a sense of the separate self, which may be in contrast to the fact that we are not isolated beings and that we have physiological and psychological needs to be social. And then obviously well, maybe not obviously, but a lot of folks who are familiar with various teachings and practices of consciousness and spirituality, it's about everything being connected kind of thing. So is there a dissonance there between strengthening the individual self and
no,
losing your connectivity? Or
there isn't. I think it's misinformation, or it's just not having awareness. Again, to me, look, if we were all the same, life would be dull. And if we could be all the same, maybe it would be easier, but we're not. And so there's beauty in the spaces between us. When I do couples therapy, I try to inspire each person to be themselves and to be different, and for the other partner to be okay with that difference. Again, the spaces that divide us, the things that divide us, create the beauty and the harmony. And so we can be part of a collective, but also be different individuals. And also, if I'm aware of my individuality, I might feel proud of it. I might feel less bad about myself. I might engage in a little less, critical mental mutilation. I might be less hard on myself. So building up self-esteem and having that sense of self is important, not only so I treat myself better, but there's a good chance that I'm going to treat others better. Collectively, we are better if we are individuals and we care about each other's individuality.
There is a distinction, at least I wrote it as a separate question. So at one point I saw a distinction in this, is how our spiritual growth is related to our mental health. And so not comparing those similarities like we've done, but how they can actually dovetail. And so a couple of examples that I noted, and then just see what your thoughts are on this. One is that, well, let's say you're me, and I've experienced anxiety about my spiritual side, if you will. So, but it's not just me. You hear things like, am I meditating right? Or why am I not farther along on my path? And so that is kind of an anxious thought, or can be a very anxious thought. And
that's
so
kind of a mental health issue about your spirituality.
Yeah.
There are 3 very common thinking habits that people with anxiety use. And you asked about people that worry a lot. Well, worriers use this too. 3, well, there's many, but these are the 3 that are the most popular, and they're in the book as well. One is, I need an excessive amount of control, meaning I have an aversion to uncertainty and I always like guarantees. I'm always looking for those things. So I don't like this uneasy feeling about my spirituality. What does that mean? I don't like the uncertainty of my growth. I used to have everything figured out, and now I don't have things figured out, which again is the beauty of being in the inquiry. The second one is perfectionism, getting back to what you just said. I'm not meditating right. I'm failing because it's not perfect. I see things in black and white terms. I succeeded 100%, but I fail at 96%. If I don't meditate perfectly for 30 minutes, something's wrong with me. And then the third one is people pleasing or reliance on others for approval. I'm always worried about disappointing people. I want everybody to like me. So you put all those 3 together, and if you put that on top of your spiritual awakening and or your spiritual practice, you're going to cause yourself a lot of anxiety. So that's where anxiety treatment might actually help with your spiritual growth.
Yeah. Yeah. A slightly different take on this idea of where spiritual and mental health intersect more, especially if there are aspects of mental health that may need some help. But there are some ideas, some schools of thought, some individuals that I'm certainly familiar with, and these are not very far out ideas of, it's sometimes referred to as the soul's contract, where the difficulties in our lives were part of a blueprint, for lack of better terms, that and before we incarnate, we have decided as a soul the growth challenges that we want in this life. And so I just wanted to bring that up because at least some in our audience might be familiar with this and might also see that mental health may be something that is part of why we're having this life and dealing with those challenges. So have you run into that? I'm just curious if you have thoughts.
I have. People will often say to me, why me? Why have I been, crippled with this anxiety disorder, or this depression, or this addiction? And we explore so many different ideas of why that is, why people are wired a certain way. I always give the example of me and my brother, and I talk about it in the book. My brother is the most laid back guy. It seems like, he came from a different litter. He's so different than everybody in my family. And I am a pretty edgy, intense person, and my brother is not. So did that come from, if you believe in past lives, a previous life? Maybe so. Is he working out some karma? Am I working out some karma? I don't know, but it's definitely a possibility. Right. So those things are never put aside because it's quote unquote not psychotherapy. I think the two of them work together. I've never helped anybody in a therapeutic practice without talking about these spiritual signposts, and vice versa. So I've never done, it without it the other way. So they both have to be together. So that's a good question. And I don't know the answer to it. So that's why we stay in the inquiry about that one too.
Right. And I think inquiry is part of that, but I know my experience is that when even the concept of, say, a soul's contract, it was first brought to my awareness, that kind of triggers that observer mode more. It
Yes.
stops that rumination, those swirling thoughts, and it gives a different perspective to reflect on, which is part of what you also prescribe in terms of reflecting versus just reacting. And if nothing more than just an academic kind of theoretical question to be like, well, what if this major challenge, this, could be some of the worst things that would come anybody's way in life. What if, that may be part of what Viktor Frankl did, is saw that as a way of, maybe this is part of a lesson. What is the lesson I'm supposed to learn here?
And can I help you rise above that, or can I help you nurture it? It depends on whatever their soul contract interpretation is. If it's a negative one, obviously that makes me worry for them. But it's kind of like, do I choose a God that's criticizing me or a God that's punishing me? Or am I going to choose to believe in a God that loves me? And I say, you're going to have to make a choice. But either way, I'm going to say, tell me how that works for you. And tell me where you read that and what that's about. And let's work with that. So it doesn't matter what they bring up. It's all grist for the mill, as they say. It's all really, really important. And by the way, what if there is a soul contract? And what if that's totally true? And what if somebody that's suffering from a severe mental illness right now is working out something from a past life? I don't know that that's not true. Maybe it's entirely true.
Yeah.
So and it's always a therapeutic issue. It'll always come up.
And for those who have not read the book, the last chapter of the book, prior to the afterword we'll talk about in a moment, you bring all this together, and you do just a lovely job of synthesizing everything that preceded in the book with the idea of some spiritual component of our lives that it may relate to. And it reminds me that what is in there are the common elements of self-love and self-compassion and surrendering. And you have this wonderful story that I think was this from Pema Chodron, perhaps, that you were talking about, with the warrior
yes,
having to battle her fear, and realizes that the best way to deal with the fear is to put her weapons down, and it's a matter of not fighting it, and it's a form of acceptance and surrendering, but not giving in and kowtowing. It's just letting it be.
Exactly. That story and many other stories that are in there too are a big tool that I use in psychotherapy as well. Sometimes it's easier for people to read about themselves through archetypes or through characters. And I use a Jungian dream in there too, and several different types of stories, which people have probably seen before too, but they're just recycled in a different way, or I've added my little twist to them. And so stories are very, very important as well. But in the end, people that don't develop this type of awareness about themselves and don't create this abundance about things that they have, and being aware of all the beauty in the world and the people that we can connect to, even if you live in a cold or difficult town, people who don't connect to that stuff don't get well as quick. The ones that are much more open to that get well much quicker, because they find meaning, they find abundance. If it's not making your first million, maybe there's abundance in, having a nice conversation with, the gas station clerk, or having a nice conversation with a friend, or calling up a family member and connecting with them. So that's the kind of softness that kind of slowing down everything and having much more awareness is what people do best with.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we've got a few minutes left, and so I do think it would be very helpful to talk a bit about your afterward, because that is what was, I guess, a feature of this re-release, and you speak about what's going on now. You know, I guess when you wrote it, we were over a year into the pandemic. If you have some of the statistics in there at the tip of your brain and can show those, great. If not, that's fine. But just tell us a bit about what was in the afterward and what you see now, and then there is hope that you see as well.
Yeah, and remember, so all the things that I talked about today were gravely challenged by the pandemic. Remember, it compromised our ability to seek comfort in groups. So we couldn't reach out the way we usually do. Eventually, we got it all with the Zoom and everything, but even that, it's not the same. We're all having a meeting right now, and it's great that we can do it, but obviously it would be better face to face. So there was so much isolation. There was so much interruption of treatment. There was so much interruption of medications, of every kind of process that anyone was in. And then there was the excessive worry. You know, it's one thing to say, okay, we need to hunker and bunker for 3 months and everything's going to be fine after that. But we didn't have that luxury. This went on for months and months and months. And even after a year, we didn't know. Yes, we started to get vaccinated, but still for a lot of people, that's not enough. So if you put all that together, and again, I'm touching on only a few things because I know we're short of time, what we're afraid of is this causing what's called a collective complex depression, where once a lot of this is resolved and people start assessing their losses, they're going to have what we call double depressions. And so, but I still think that despite all of that and how grave and so dire it does sound, there is a lot of hope, because we've also seen a lot of amazing things happen because of the pandemic. People have come together in many, many ways. Our ability to connect in this way is the new norm. Again, it's not the same, but it's pretty good. You know, people have had to reevaluate their lives. And in many ways, they have brought in a lot of spirituality. They have made a lot of good changes in their lives. And so I'm not talking about the people that had a lot of losses. I'm talking about the people that were, you know, perhaps spared the heavy losses, but had losses that they could learn from. So that's what the afterword talks about.
Yeah, but you do also address those with loss and this concept of complex grief, which is substantial, and there is a lot of that, and as well as you know, very significant numbers, and you forecast a little that there may still be a wave that kind of follows the wave of the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, or the current aspects of the pandemic with economic and healthcare and hospital strain, et cetera. But collectively as a society, we're dealing with levels of anxiety and depression and grief and loss that we have not seen maybe ever in these numbers, at least in the United States.
That's right. So remember, there's a big difference between a tragedy and an atrocity. Atrocities are such events where you can't glean any redemption out of it. You can't learn anything from it. It's just horrible. This was horrible for many people, but I see it more as a tragedy. A lot of bad things happen. A lot of people lost money. A lot of people lost their lives, but we've learned so much from it as well, too, in small ways and big ways. So big difference there. This has been one big tragedy, but again, we are very, very resourceful. If you go back to 9/11 and those horrible events, we were able to come together pretty quickly after that. Again, another horrible situation, but we didn't have that luxury to come together the way that we did this time around with the pandemic as we did with 9/11. So we are learning different ways to cope. You know, for me, I can now cook. I couldn't cook anything before the pandemic. Now I'm actually a pretty good cook. So that's one small thing that I learned. And I think that, you know, people are much more resilient than they give us credit for.
Well, and you know, maybe, and it's interesting you brought up cooking, just because I was thinking that maybe part of our collective response to this is in the same way that if we were to receive new information that, say, eating something is better or worse for you, and then collectively that would work its way into our diets and our conscious approach to what we eat. I think things like meditation and getting out in nature and just nurturing your soul are becoming more well understood than, and I think, in mentioned this in several conversations, that you can go to almost any small town, much less the big cities, at least in this country, there's a yoga studio. That wasn't present. And the amount of information available on the web and programs like this are widely available. And it's becoming, even though we talked before that there are still stigma and taboos, there is also an incredible growth in appreciating and being aware of these things, and it becoming more known that we can't, again, going back to this phrase, we can't continue just being human doings. We need to have time to be, and to be alone as well as with each other, and nurture those aspects of our other parts of our health. And with that, even with this kind of bolus of circumstance that has raised the amount of anxiety, for instance, that is being seen in the nation right now and around the world, the tools are more accessible, and the awareness of using them and the importance of using them, I think, has also grown.
Yeah. And so one last thing I wanted to say is everybody that I've seen, well, almost everybody that I've seen, and that's a lot. I've seen thousands of people over the last 28 years. And the people that come to me the most, who are the most troubled, regardless of the diagnosis, are people that have been very stuck in the human doing quality. Let's pretend that the human doing person doesn't have any kind of spirituality, or doesn't have any of these types of awarenesses about themselves and about people in the world, like we discussed today. That is not sustainable. And that's why eventually they end up in therapy. And that's where, as I said before, we want to try to preempt that. That's somebody coming to me who's already in a crisis. By helping people and collectively, adding to this sort of tipping point and this sort of shift in consciousness, is creating this awareness. And that's why that yoga studio on the corner is as important as a Starbucks. Yoga also gets a bad rap because yoga involves sometimes too much length of time, sometimes involves meditation, and people get restless and they get impatient with it. So I actually reduce yoga in terms of time frame, and in terms of meditation, I also reduce that time as well too. So when people can take 30 minutes and break it down to 5 minutes and do it 3 times a day, they actually do it much better than the 30-minute in the morning.
Or even just 10 minutes in front of something green. I mean, there have been studies that if you work out indoors and you're watching something on a screen and it has pictures of plants, you're going to have a better response than if you're doing the same exercise in the same room, not even viewing something in plants. So it's just, and even that is helpful. And that, to me, is a form of meditation.
And the simplest form of mindfulness, and this is my favorite part of doing mindfulness with people, is when Eckhart Tolle, who's another kind of spiritual person that I follow, when he was asked what the definition of Zen was, he said the definition of Zen is doing one thing at a time. And the person who is a human doing, they are constantly multitasking. And everyone who's listening, all of you do it. I do it too. You're eating dinner, you're also listening to music, or you're watching TV, or you're answering your emails, or you're answering texts. Mindfulness is, wait a second, I'm just going to eat my meal today. For the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to eat. I'm going to turn everything off and just eat my meal. When you go on a walk, just go for the walk. When you're having a one-on-one with somebody, just have a one-on-one. That creates much more awareness, and that creates mindfulness.
Yeah, and reduces anxiety, and probably is growing your spirit. We can wrap this up, but I do want to give you a chance, because as we're talking about available resources, This Is My Brave is one of those, and I think it's a wonderful one. So please go ahead and just share a little bit about what it is and kind of what you're doing with that in Los Angeles.
So This Is My Brave, and you can find them at thisismybrave.org, is a national organization. They are a nonprofit 501c3, and their goal is to end mental illness stigma. And they do that via producing these live theater shows, and they've done over 60 of them already. This is where up to 10 people with mental health conditions tell their story on stage live. And sometimes it's the first time they're ever on stage. Sometimes it's the first time they're ever even talking about their mental health condition. And they do it via song, dance, monologue, comedy, whatever they want, whatever medium they want. And it's very uplifting. You know, it's the idea that storytelling saves lives. And people always talk about it afterwards as having a spiritual experience, because they're in a room full of people that are giving them so much support. There's never a dry eye in that whole auditorium. And it's usually between 300 and 500 people there. They are all filmed and videotaped. They are on YouTube if you want to go check them out. And some of these people are extremely talented. So it's kind of like American Idol, but there's no winner and loser. So everyone gets to be on stage, and the stories are amazing, and the community is huge. So the next show is going to be in Los Angeles in 2022. Hopefully nothing will change with pandemic and masks and infections and all that stuff, and we don't have another mask whiplash recurrence, but hopefully it will still take place. So people can donate, they can sponsor, they can do whatever they want, they can get involved any way they want, or they can call me or email me, and I can give you all of the links. But it's thisismybrave.org, and they're an amazing organization. And I am co-producing the next This Is My Brave show, the one in Los Angeles that I just mentioned.
I believe I did see on YouTube that you actually were a cast member, if you will, in one of those.
That's right. Thanks for reminding me. So in 2017, I was a cast member, the LA show, and I spoke about my history with anxiety and the difficulties that I had being raised in an immigrant family where, you know, words like depression and anxiety were an import. They were not real words that they could relate to. And I love my parents. They are deceased. I love them, but they didn't have the tools to deal with my mental health condition. And so luckily I got help and everything worked out okay. But yeah, it was a struggle. So I talked about that story. And I was, again, one of 10 people that told their story as well. It was a great show.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, you know, the goal of this organization to eradicate mental health stigma, and I think IFGT would include that as a measure of when we've reached a spiritual consciousness tipping point in humanity, where that just wouldn't even be recognized as something to do anything but extend our love and compassion to anybody needing care for those types of issues. And
good point. Good point.
You know,
that's a big shift.
Yeah,
that's a big shift. And getting back to Viktor Frankl, remember, experiences like that, what do? They increase the sensitivity of our hearts. And when you do that, you are much more open to people. Hence, you are connecting more. When you're connecting more, you feel better. Why do you feel better? We don't know, but it's true. When we connect with other people, we feel less alone. We feel connected to the collective, you know? So again, for me, whatever aligns the planets, whatever keeps the sun shining, I don't have answers to that, but I don't need the answer. I just know what makes me feel connected.
Yeah, yeah. And there's been recent information I've heard about now there's enough data being collected for the folks who were isolated during the pandemic. Some of the ill effects of that are at least as, if not more, debilitating than what the virus itself brought, just from the loneliness and whatnot. So yeah, it's key. Absolutely. And it's great that we've got This Is My Brave out there to bring physically bring people together and helping people find that courage to share. And that, I have no doubt, ripples out and influences others to understand they're not alone. And they also can find courage and recognize that this is part of our existence as human beings. And no one gets out unscathed, and we all have our issues, and being caring and compassionate toward each other is also part of the human condition. So
That's right. My favorite quote is, the only people in the world, wait, what is it again? I said it wrong. The only normal people in the world are people you don't know very well.
yes, I love
So
that.
once you get to know people, everyone's got a little bit of something in varying degrees. But I've
Right.
never seen anybody that has not struggled or has not had difficult times, low times, crazy times, hysterical times. Everyone's got them.
Yeah, right.
Time to raise the consciousness about that one.
Yeah. Anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to?
No, I
make-
think that's it. Thanks for
Okay.
listening and giving me the opportunity to share all of this. I enjoy talking about this subject.
Yeah, no, well, thank you so much. And strongly encourage anyone who has any interest or has any need to pick up the book.
It's okay to ask for help. Look, that's another spiritual practice, knowing that sometimes you can't do it yourself and you need help.
Right.
Again, we didn't evolve in a vacuum. We have been taking care of each other for a long time. And the human doing thinker doesn't think that they need to do that, or it's shameful to do that, or there's a machismo about it. All kinds of stuff that are sometimes cultural, sometimes they're part of our development. And I help to untangle all of that. Being human, being a human being is very different than being a human doing.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. All right. Well, thank you again, John. It's been a pleasure. Thank our live
you.
audience, and wish everyone a good night and safe times, and also much less anxious times.
Thanks again. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.